Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, over the past week or so, a lot of us on the outside of the occupied territories have watched in horror as disturbing images continue to come out of the occupied territories of Israeli violence towards Palestinians. At the root of this latest bout of violence, and of course, we can possibly list a long number of causes of what we're seeing now happening across the occupied territories. Nevertheless, one of the root causes of this latest bout of violence is what's happened vis-a-vis the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem and the attempt by Israelis to expel Palestinian families from their homes. At least 4 Palestinian families, as far as I'm aware, are set to be expelled from their respective homes, even though an Israeli court has so far given a 30-day stay in that decision that it is set to make. The Palestinians do not, again, to the best of my ability, have the ability to even provide a defense in a court regarding their own homes in which they've been since 1957. According to what I was reading, the Israelis claim that they are the true owners of those homes, that these residents are now permanent residents and are not, in fact, landlords, as one would understand. That seems to be one of the root causes, but of course, this goes way beyond just this one incident. This goes back to the entire issue of the occupation, something we've spoken about a number of times, as well as just overall apartheid-like policies that many times we've spoken about again on this show as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Francesca Albanese, who is an author of Palestinian Refugees and International Law. She's also a lawyer, and she's joining us today from Jakarta. Joining us today from The Hague is Mouin Rabbani, who is a co-editor of Jabarin and a Middle East analyst. And joining us from Ramallah is Shawan Jabarin, who is general director of Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian human rights organization based in the West Bank. Shawan, Mouin, and Francesca, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Shawan, let me start with you. As I said, at the root of this latest bout of violence is Sheikh Jarrah and that issue of the expulsion of these families from their homes. Again, that in and of itself is not completely new, but is this an attempt, as we understand it, of the further Judaization of Jerusalem?
Yes, that's the case. And Sheikh Jarrah, it's a spark. Al-Aqsa Mosque is a spark. Palestinians, they have been living under this occupation since so long. The Israelis, they demolish their houses, expel them out of their lands, uproot their trees, killing them, restrict their movement, doing all of these things. And for the benefits and for the interests of the settlers, which their existence is illegal. And this is also, it's a war crime according the ICC statute. That's the case. I think the people, they fed up, and the Israelis, they taking the extreme line to push Palestinians outside of their city. They squeeze their existence in the city. They start feeling, the Palestinians, they start feeling that they have no any more space in their city. And the Israelis, they are even inciting against them. They shouting to kill Arabs there. That's the case. This is the daily life situation in Palestine: killing, restrictions, destruction, uprooting, all of these things. I think no other people can live in this situation. There is no freedom, there is no dignity, there is no respect of fundamental rights. And here you are speaking about a new generation, and the Israelis' policy and strategy is that if they continue ignoring the Palestinians' rights, maybe by time, Palestinians, they will forget and they will give up. Yeah. And I think the answer came just directly from young generation, from 15 years old to 25 years old. They are in the streets. They show that they are standing behind their rights. They will not give up. They are strong enough. They have their own ways how to fight for their rights. Yeah. This is the case, and I think everyone has to rethink. Everyone has to rethink about the situation, about the future, about the Israeli strategies as a colonial occupation in Palestine.
Mouin, I'm just going to play devil's advocate for a moment. The Israeli argument, as you well know, is that this land is theirs, that this area, even Sheikh Jarrah, is theirs. Again, this is in front of a court, as I put in my introduction as well. We've seen those viral videos of Israeli settlers trying to take over one of those houses, saying that if it wouldn't be him, then somebody else would take it over. What are your thoughts on that argument on the part of the Israelis?
Well, quite apart from the legal and political aspects that Mr. Jabarin has discussed, I think we need to also recognize the incredible absurdity of the situation, in the sense that, yes, it is true that there were Jewish residents in Sheikh Jarrah before 1948, but it was never the case that Sheikh Jarrah was an exclusively Jewish neighborhood. Secondly, those laying claim to these properties today are in no way the descendants of the former Jewish residents of Sheikh Jarrah. Their claim to these properties is based on the simple reality that they are Jewish too. So imagine, if Muslims and Catholics and Seventh-day Adventists and whatnot go all around the world claiming property simply on the basis that they have the same denominational identity as people who once lived in that neighborhood, and then use that to ethnically cleanse that neighborhood of anyone and everyone who isn't part of that same denomination. I mean, I really do think the extraordinary absurdity which is at the root of this issue, needs to be recognized. That's the first point. The second point is this is not just a real estate dispute, as Israelis are claiming. What's really here is the illegality of Israel to even have jurisdiction over this case, because it is occupied territory, and therefore any decisions regarding Sheikh Jarrah need to conform strictly to the relevant international laws, the Fourth Geneva Convention, right. The Hague regulations of 1907, and so on. And the Israeli court, whether it's a supreme or a miniature or whatever court, simply has no jurisdiction and no authority to supersede international law. And what we really see here is, on the one hand, the law of the jungle, where Israel is saying might makes right. And then, unfortunately, we also have an international community, or at least the West, led by Washington and Brussels, saying, yes, we have our concerns about this, but we're going to look the other way and we'll only engage in explicit condemnations if and when the Palestinians respond. That's what we're seeing today.
Francesca, I wanted to ask you about more of the law angle of this, if I may. The EU and the United Nations, in fact, more correctly, have said that Israel has possibly carried out war crimes when it comes specifically to this, in their words, land right case in East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah. And, when, in your opinion, when it comes to the issue of jurisdiction and not, as Mouin there mentioned, what are your thoughts on that? What does the international law say about this?
Let me say that I would like to make a general comment, first of all, that there is a general climate of lack of compliance with international law in general in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Jerusalem in particular. I would like to answer this question, but also making reference to what Mouin said and the comment you, Waqar, made in the beginning. I mean, the many factors, the many causes that have led to this situation. So what international law says on the case of the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, is that their status is occupied land. As the occupying power, Israel cannot extend its domestic civil legal system to it. What has happened is that while the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, and I can return to that, where I've been there since 1948, because these are refugees from the coastal area of former historical Palestine, and who were forced to flee, to leave their houses, when their homes, when Israel was established in 1948, and were accommodated in Sheikh Jarrah by the United Nations, UNRWA in particular, which provides assistance and relief to them, in agreement with the Jordanian government. So they were there, they've been there as refugees, as already displaced since 1948. Then what happened is that in 1967, Israel has extended the remit of its laws and administration to include the old city and the Arab inhabited areas, is Jerusalem. But this is in contravention with international law, which requires an occupying power to respect the laws in force of the countries. And this is reaffirmed by countless UN resolutions that have since then called for any act aiming at changing the character of Jerusalem as null and void. Now, in international law, there are consequences for acts that are null and void. And again, Mouin mentioned in action the neglect of the international community that frankly doesn't do more than issuing angry statements at Israel. There should be actions that escalate from reprimand to suspension of diplomatic actions until Israel complies with international law. Yeah. Instead, there is a tolerance for discriminatory laws and policies that enforce the confiscation of Palestinian property in favor of settlers and the forced displacement of the Palestinians. But also, I would like to make a comment, if you allow me, Waqar, sure, on the legality of the settlers' claims.
Just quickly, if you can, please. Yeah. Go ahead, Francesca.
Yes. To support the argument that the whole state apparatus of Israel, from the parliament to the executive to the courts, serve the same purpose, because the defense of Sheikh Jarrah residents in court has tried to exhibit evidence that there was no claim demonstrating the evidence, supporting the ownership by these Jewish settlers, as Shawan was saying, in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. This evidence has not been accepted. Right. So what recourse is left to the Palestinians?
Indeed. Shawan, I also wanted to talk about the reaction, right? So what we've seen, as you had pointed out in your answer as well, what happened at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Israelis raiding it essentially as people were praying. We've all seen those really disturbing images, and this didn't happen just one night. It happened for nights in a row. Then we've had what's happened between Hamas and Israel as well, with Hamas firing rockets also. And at the same time, I wanted to throw this in the mix, the fairly muted response, if I may use that phrase, on the part of the Palestinian Authority as well. What do you make of the overall Palestinian response to this? And I'm not talking about the people. I'm talking about more of those in leadership positions, such as Hamas and the PA.
Look, Hamas and PA, they have to defend the rights of the Palestinians, and also they have to defend the right of a protection for civilians. And there is no protection for Palestinians from any part, from any side. International community, occupying power, Palestinians themselves, they can't, for instance, protect Palestinians in the occupied territory. That's the case. And I think part of their responsibility is to defend the Palestinians' rights in the face of the illegal actions, in the face of the international crimes taking place in daily basis in Palestine in different ways and in different methods. That's what it's required of the Palestinian officials, or let me say leaders. But also the leaders, they are divided. Here you are speaking about one side, the official side. They tied their hands and they tied everything with which called Oslo. Israel, they damaged and they ignored Oslo completely from A to Z since so long. And the Palestinians, they try just to stay in that. I think it doesn't work. Now the Palestinian leaders, they lost, I think, their credibility in the eyes of their people. I'm here speaking about the official leaders. This is clearly, this is not, I'm not exaggerating. Go to the field, for instance, go to the street, and you see people what they are saying. Why? Because Israel, they ignored all of these things. That's the case. And what they see that there is no protection, there is no respect, there is no accountability, holding criminals accountable. And the maximum from the international communities is just condemnations and that. And it doesn't work. Here, I think the people, they lost their hope. And when it comes to protection, I think this is a natural need for any people over the world, for any person. And if the state doesn't provide protection, if the family doesn't provide the protection, if the authority doesn't provide the protection, here, the people, they will start looking for their own way to protect themselves. And because of that, you see, young people, they are not organized, just they fed up and they go, to the street trying to defend their dignity, their protection as much as they can. And if things continue, later on you will see, maybe actions that you dislike, maybe I dislike, but it's not like or dislike. The problem is we have to analyze what's the main cause behind all of these things. What's the context? The people, they have fundamental rights to enjoy and to exercise their self-determination on their land. That's the case. The Israelis...
Shawan, if you allow me, I wanted to bring that point in, and you make a very pertinent point there. I wanted to put that to Mouin. Mouin, I want to talk to you as well about this right to self-defense, right? Not just necessarily from an international law perspective, but just overall as just a very natural right that we all as humans have. I mean, not even necessarily on a nation level, but just as individual human beings too. We have a right to defend our property, our family, etc. That's an understood logical right that we all have. But you know very well, Mouin, sitting where you are and your vantage point as well, that there's this huge argument going on and that the Israelis, or many on the Israeli pro-Israel side, have tried to change the narrative about this entire latest bout of violence into then just about the rockets from Gaza, for example, and not, again, a proper context of that. What are your thoughts of this?
Well, it's clear there's a long-standing Israeli campaign, or a campaign by Israel and its apologists, to delegitimize and to criminalize not armed Palestinian resistance, but any and all forms of Palestinian opposition to Israel and its policies. So if the Palestinians take up arms, they're terrorists. If they seek to launch a boycott, they're anti-Semites. If they negotiate for their independence, they're intransigent. So it's quite clear that the issue that Israel and its supporters and its apologists have with the Palestinians is not armed resistance, but any and all opposition to Israeli policy and Israeli impunity in its dealings with the Palestinians. I think there's also a second issue here that's relevant, which is that one thing that Israel has very successfully done is to fragment the Palestinian people. So if you look just at Israel and the occupied territories, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, it's only them dealing with their issues. Gazans have no business responding to anything Israel does to Palestinians in the West Bank or in East Jerusalem. What we've seen now, and it's quite interesting, is that this is the first conflict between Israel and Hamas that is unrelated to Israeli policy towards the Gaza Strip. In other words, what's happening is that Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are directly responding to an Israeli attack on Palestinian rights in East Jerusalem. The same can be said for the Palestinian communities inside Israel. And so, despite the extraordinary violence and suffering that we've been witnessing in the past few days and weeks, I do think there is a potentially hopeful sign here, which is that Palestinians are once again beginning to mobilize as a people rather than as fragmented communities who are focused only on very local issues.
All right, Francesca, we're quickly running out of time, so I want to give you the final word before I let all three of you go. We have about a minute and a half left. Again, on the international law aspect, if I may, with you again, on the right of self-defense, and again, as I said, it's a very logical thing to have for every human to have that right to self-defense, but again, it's not understood in that way by much, or many people, I should say. So I shouldn't say much of the international community, but many people online as well as those on the other side. Why do Palestinians, or why shouldn't Palestinians on the other side's argument have the right to self-defense? Is it that in this case the Palestinians are wrong?
I agree with you, but for the benefit of the audience, let me say that the right of self-defense is a fundamental right existing under international law, and it's the right of a state to react, including through the use of force, to an act of violence, an act of aggression. Now, the point is that here in Israel is very effective at fabricating its own version of reality. In the current context, instead of de-escalating the tension that was mounting and rising in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, has turned more violent and repressive toward the Palestinians. I'll mention the case of the shooting, killing, and tear gassing of the protesters. Of the worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is clearly a provocation which armed groups in Gaza had intimated Israel to refrain from. I won't argue that a barrage of rockets is a legitimate proportional reaction, because any military reaction should not target civilians, but exactly as you say, why the Palestinians shouldn't have the right to self-defense. So Israel's claim is clearly doesn't justify Israel's invocation of the principles of self-defense, and we should definitely rethink the way we approach the occupied Palestinian territory beyond the fragmentation that Mouin is right, is sort of dominating the narrative and the public discourse.
We'll leave it there at that. We really appreciate Francesca and Mouin and Shawan for taking their time out of their no doubt busy schedules to share their expertise with us about this issue of what's happened and on the ground there in the occupied territories over this past week or more. Disturbing images, as I said, have been coming out of what's happened at Al-Aqsa, what's happened in Sheikh Jarrah, what's continuing to happen now in Gaza as well. Where is this all leading to, and what are the root causes of this? That's really important, to have an objective conversation about all of the above, not just trying to to use the narrative of just Gaza versus Israel, for example, Hamas versus Israel, as one of our guests alluded to. This is much deeper. The roots of this current bout of violence are much deeper than just even Sheikh Jarrah and the battle over who owns that land, who has the right to live on that land. This is way deeper an issue than just that, and that's very important then to highlight whenever we're discussing this, especially by people who are on the ground there, such as Shawan, who is joining us from Ramallah. We'll leave it there for now. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, for a while now, we've been talking about the possibility of the United States re-entering the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Once again, we have had an incident in the open waters in the Strait of Hormuz, where the U.S. says one of its Coast Guard ships has fired warning shots, 30 warning shots, in fact, towards Iranian vessels, which were apparently in some form of threatening position towards U.S. vessels. As I said, at the same time, we do have the Vienna talks happening. Some days we're told that things are going extremely well, and other days reports come out of major obstacles in the path. And of course, one of the biggest obstacles is Iran's demand for all sanctions to be lifted in one go. Then on top of that, we have within the U.S. establishment as well, between Democrats and Republicans, the argument over sanctions altogether. We've had now 50 members of the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, calling on Biden to lift the sanctions in line with that nuclear deal. And on the other side, not too long ago, we'd spoken about on this show, Republicans, in fact, asking for the very opposite, trying to tie Biden's hands so that he cannot then lift the sanctions as promised for the Iranians and as Donald Trump had placed on the Islamic Republic as well. Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Deina Abdelkader, who is an Associate Professor of International Relations at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. She's also a Research Associate for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. She's joining us this morning from Lowell, Massachusetts. Joining us from Portland, Oregon this morning is Dr. Robert Asaadi, who's an instructor of Political Science and International Studies at Portland State University. He's also the author of Post-Revolutionary Iran, the Leader, the People, and the Three Powers. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is Reza Khanzadeh, who is a research fellow at Sharif University think tank. He's also a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford, and he works with Iranian organizations on issues related to human rights, public policy, and foreign relations. Reza, Robert, and Deina, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Deina, I'd like to start with you. Overall, as I said, there are days that come and go that in one day it seems that things are going very well when it comes to those talks, and on other days it seems like the obstacles are impossible to overcome. What is your reading about where we're at right now, possibly about the U.S. re-entering the deal at all?
My reading is it's very complicated because, as you well know, the degree of variance and the degree of polarization in the United States has a lot to do with the Iranian situation. The Obama policies and the brokerage of a deal with Iran during the Obama presidency created a lot of angst in certain political circles here, and that was utilized in the polarization process later on in elections. So that's definitely not going to pan out well, even with the Democratic Party in such control, even with Biden being part of the original agreement. So it is a very tense moment. I just like to say that preceding the incident that we're talking about today, a ship was captured at sea with armaments, Russian armaments, that was intended to go to the Houthis of Yemen. And that is not really highlighted or mentioned, but the U.S. captured those ships, and it did take all the Kalashnikovs or similar to Kalashnikovs on that ship. So it seems to me to be a continuation of quid pro quo.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Robert. A lot has happened, right, ever since Donald Trump walked away from the deal. I wonder, and I've asked many experts this, is it even possible, realistically, to expect these two to really be able to come to an understanding amongst each other, considering the mistrust has probably only gotten significantly worse in these years?
Right, exactly. I think that's a really, that's a really important point. It seems to me this recent incident, it highlights kind of three lines of inquiry. First, there's the regional security dynamic. Second, the nuclear issue itself, as you mentioned. And third, the point about U.S. domestic politics. So the first thing I would say is just to bring to the attention of your viewers that such clashes in the Gulf are, of course, not without precedent. Your viewers may recall on January 12th, 2016, a U.S. vessel actually drifted into Iran's territorial waters and was seized by Iranian Revolutionary Guard patrol boats. The 10 American sailors on board were held for a period of only 16 hours, precisely because Iranian and American diplomats were able to communicate about the matter and explain this was a result of a technical failure and not a kind of incursion into Iran's territorial waters. And the American sailors were released without incident. So this is the critical connection between these types of incidences and the necessity of normal diplomatic relations between Iran and the U.S., which you rightly point out, since May 2018, when the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA outside of the dispute resolution mechanism, which was part of the deal, right? These negotiators were not naive in thinking that there wouldn't be disputes between the parties. The U.S. chose not to use the dispute resolution mechanism and withdrew. Yes. Regarding kind of future prospects, the final thing I can say is there's actually new public opinion polling data of Iranians from February of this year. And 64% of Iranians say they would like the next president. Presidential elections in Iran will be happening next month. 64% of Iranians said we would like the next president to be someone who currently critiques the current president, Rouhani, and his policies. And kind of the most prominent policy is his support for nuclear negotiations. So
Indeed.
Iranian public opinion seems to be swinging away from support for the deal.
And, I remember that incident, in fact, that had happened in the Gulf. I was a journalist in Iran at that time. And yes, you're completely right, Robert, that things have changed a lot. I mean, I would imagine that if that happened today, we'd be in a very different situation. And Reza, I wanted to, in fact, pick up on that very point and, talk about the fact that things have changed so much in these years then. Even if we have somebody who comes into power, for example, in Iran, who still wants to hold on to the deal, what I imagine even a conservative or principalist, as they're known in Iran, may want to hold on to the deal, but can it survive in its current, shape and its current write-up? Because it seems that, again, so much has changed and the other side is not now willing to lift the sanctions as promised, that we're at a crossroads and a stalemate that is very hard to overcome?
Yeah, I do think so. I think we have reached a certain type of stalemate that goes beyond just these foreign negotiations between Iran, Europe, and the U.S., also Russia and China. I think it's also domestic as well, and it has many layers to it. But on a very broad level, we have this power dynamic, if you will, between the IRGC and the conservative camp, if you will, and the moderates or the reformists, if you will. And it's kind of a power struggle almost for the future of Iran, because we see right now we have certain individuals coming and declaring their bid for presidency. Two key names right now that have come out is Sayed Mohammad and Hossein Dehban, who are both former members of the IRGC. And we're seeing that there could be a paradigm shift, quite a significant one too, seeing who's going to be the next president. Although foreign policy issues kind of go through, Khamenei, even still having these types of individuals running for president, if they do become president, it could be a much steeper hill to climb when it comes to JCPOA. And also keep in mind that in 2023, there's another part of the JCPOA where the U.S. The U.S. Congress would have to actually lift sanctions, and then also the Iranian parliament would have to ratify their end of the deal, which would allow more inspections by the IAEA. Whether or not that's going to happen, we have both domestic issues coming, because next year you have certain elections in the U.S. and then in 2024, obviously the U.S. presidency. So there's so many elections happening in these next couple of years. Who's going to be in power? Who's not? And it's much more layered than that. But just on a broad level, that's the complications we're looking at.
Indeed. Deina, then this goes to the Iranian argument. I want to play devil's advocate just for a moment. And the Iranians say, as you well know, Deina, that the U.S. establishment cannot get on one page when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal. And what does that then say about, again, in their words, the U.S.'s trustworthiness when it comes to it signing any deals? And again, this was not like a bilateral agreement anyhow. It was a multilateral agreement. Nevertheless, if we have one president signing something, the next president just comes in and says, no, I don't like that. I'm going to, walk away from this deal. What does that say about then stability on the part of U.S. foreign policy making?
I mean, in certain ways, and in many ways, actually, they would have a point, because for the first time, I think in U.S. history, not only partisan politics, but as one of your speakers said, basically the walking away was pretty unusual from the agreement. The problem of achieving or coming to an agreement is so rife because of the conflict in the area and the continuous struggle to create a regional hegemon, so to speak. Whether we talk about the situation in Syria, whether we talk about the situation in Yemen, there is a lot of the U.S. alliance with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and sort of fostering this relation because of our foreign interests is very much to be blamed for, unfortunately, not really going through with the agreement, whether it is trust, as you mentioned, whether it is also related to how the people feel in Iran about going through another set of negotiations where they're disappointed and where things go back to square one. So on the regional level, I think the involvement of the U.S. In terms of having proxy wars and the attempt of Russia to come back as somewhat of a power in the Middle East region is very much indicative of the degree of stability and the degree to which a deal could be struck.
That's a very good point, isn't it, Robert? Because we do see ever so slowly the U.S., I wouldn't say completely walking away from the Middle East, but certainly, lowering its involvement within the Middle East region. Is this all, do you think, a part of that, where this almost, for many lawmakers, may not be a priority on their plates right now, that there are greater priorities in their minds, be it domestic or otherwise, and that others will then come and fill in the vacuum, as Deina there said, the Russians, for example?
Yes, I think that's a really important point. And just to pick up on what Deina just mentioned there, I think we've just now concluded the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and there is a noticeable shift, I think, in this idea of the U.S. security umbrella in the region. Jake Sullivan, the Biden administration national security advisor, said, for example, in a May 2020 Foreign Affairs piece that the U.S. security umbrella gives a blank check for destabilizing behavior on the part of in the region and keeps the region on the brink of wider conflict. So I think that there has been a shift from a higher kind of level of comfort with a U.S. military presence in the region or U.S. Support for some of these states. For example, the first trip to a foreign country that the former President Trump took was not to Canada or Mexico, as is kind of the norm for U.S. presidents, but it was to Saudi Arabia. And he concluded a $110 billion arms deal as a part of that visit. So I think the Biden team, as you point out, is working toward a reduction of the U.S. military footprint in the Gulf region. The effect that has on Iran's neighbors in the Gulf, I think, remains to be seen. It highlights the really important point on regional security that I wanted to mention, and that is right now the main collective security organization is the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes only 6 of the 8 littoral states of the Gulf. It excludes Iraq and Iran. And so in 2019, President Rouhani gave his proposal for a revision of this at the UN General Assembly, in which he outlined his plan called the Hormuz Peace Initiative, using the acronym HOPE. And it calls for all 8 littoral states of the Gulf to be included, maybe even Yemen, as well as the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And, it's something like an ASEAN for the Middle East, a kind of soft security focus for the Gulf region, emphasis on disaster relief coordination, humanitarian assistance, and so on, in the hope that functional cooperation can be built in areas of general shared interest, that this could then spill over to some of the more tricky issues relating to things like freedom of navigation.
Robert, I'm going to cut in. I do apologize. We're running out of time, so I do apologize for cutting in. Reza, I wanted to give you the final word before I let all three of you go. We have about a minute and a half left. On that point that Robert there was making, we have in fact seen an effort by Iran as well as other regional countries to talk to each other. And I know this has happened in the past too. It even happened during the era of Ahmadinejad also. That's not a new effort, but nevertheless, do you think that that will pick up pace now and that the countries in the region will somehow be able to, in fact, work through their differences and possibly secure the region to quite an extent on their own?
I do believe it will pick up pace, and I also believe that they will be able to kind of handle their own regional, problems or issues, if you will. More so now because of what's going on between Israel and Palestine and Hamas. And this is going to be interesting to see what's going to happen in the coming days and weeks, because as we've seen in the news, as far as the coverage is concerned, Saudi Arabia and Iran have had 5 meetings, I think, since January. And as far as what both sides are willing to speak on publicly, these have been positive meetings. And that's obviously going through Iraq. So we have very vital, countries within the region having these face-to-face meetings. And then also we have to keep in mind of the agreements that certain Arab countries had with Israel under the Trump administration, and how the Trump administration was kind of beating themselves up because they couldn't get Saudi Arabia to also join in that agreement. And that is telling, because now we have Saudi Arabia and Iran speaking to each other, which shows that there could be a shift. There could be a move away from this kind of, a passive agreement with the U.S. to allow Israel to act a certain way or, have a foreign policy in a certain way, and kind of shift that back towards Palestine, because it seems like the entire world almost, with the exception of the United States, is on the side of Palestine. And there is a lot of conversations, throughout the Middle East that the Palestinians feel very much abandoned by their own people, so to speak, fellow Muslims. So this could be, a very serious shift if we see what happens within the coming weeks, for sure.
Indeed, and we'll definitely keep a eye on that, but we really appreciate Reza, Robert, and Deina for taking their time out, speaking to us respectively from Lowell, Portland, and Washington. We were discussing their U.S.-Iran relations within the context of what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz recently, U.S. warning shots towards Iranian ships. Again, not the first such incident, but significant nevertheless. Again, in the context of the Vienna talks, the U.S. effort seemingly to re-enter that deal, if that's even possible, really, considering the U.S. domestic realities, the fight between Republicans and Democrats over the sanctions relief that Iran was promised within that deal. This deal, of course, signed under Obama, canceled essentially, if we're to be completely honest, under Donald Trump. Can the U.S. simply just walk into it? There is also the Iranian domestic reality. Presidential elections just around the corner. What if a principalist is to win there? What does that then mean for the life of this deal? All of that, of course, is something that's really important to watch for. And as Deina there mentioned, regional context and regional involvement of both parties is extremely important as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.